The sky above New Geneva bled a dull amber, choked by the exhaust of orbital freighters that constantly reminded humanity of its secondary status. Arthur Sterling sat on the edge of a minimalist titanium bench, adjusting the high collar of his formal diplomatic tunic. To the Valen nobility milling about the crystal-paned courtyard, he was nothing more than a living receipt, a quiet concession handed over to guarantee a multi-system trade corridor. His skin did not hum with the neon psi fields that radiated from every citizen of the Dominion, nor did his posture carry the arrogant, predatory grace of a species that had conquered half the Orion Arm without breaking a sweat. He was simply a human, designated as harmless, expendable, and entirely decorative. Across the terrace, Princess Vesper of the First House watched him with the mild, detached curiosity one might reserve for an unusually quiet housepet. She was clad in robes spun from light reactive filament that shifted colors with her pulse, her golden eyes flashing in amusement as she accepted a glass of fermented nectar from a trembling minister. This marriage was a joke to her court, a clever political humiliation designed to remind Earth of its place on the cosmic ladder. She had demanded a human husband specifically because she wanted a trophy that lacked teeth, a silent reminder of the treaty terms that bound humanity to the Dominion's economic will. Arthur met her gaze across the crowded room, offering a polite, neutral nod that she immediately dismissed as the fearful compliance of a lesser being. The grand banquet hall hummed with orchestral strings played by automated sub-drones, drowning out the subterranean groans that occasionally rippled through the palace foundations. None of the guests noticed the deep, bone-rattling vibration, too wrapped up in their own psionic superiority to care about the physical reality of the stone beneath their feet. Arthur, however, had felt it hours ago. His fingers tapped a steady rhythm against his knee, calculating the frequency of the shift. In 3 months of living on this floating spire, he had mapped the palace's architectural flaws better than its own master builders. While Vesper and her peers celebrated their hollow supremacy, Arthur remained quietly alert, knowing that a kingdom built entirely on arrogance was bound to have a very weak foundation. The wedding ceremony the following morning was broadcast across 3 solar systems as a masterclass in imperial condescension. Vesper stood upon the dais of the sunken spire, her tall frame draped in shimmering ceremonial armor that projected holographic wings of authority. Arthur stood beside her, clad in Earth's plainest diplomatic gray, looking like an accountant standing next to a star god. When the High Arbiter asked if the groom had any vows to offer the Dominion, Arthur simply stated that he hoped the trade corridor would remain open and unhindered. The court erupted into polite, mocking laughter, interpreting his pragmatic brevity as a total lack of cultural depth or emotional resonance. Vesper did not even look at him as she slipped a heavy, cold iron band around his wrist, a symbolic shackle meant to signify his integration into her household. Throughout the afternoon receptions, Vesper paraded Arthur through the high gardens like a prize hound at a livestock exhibition. Alien nobles crowded around, asking him insulting questions about Earth's primitive technology and whether humans felt pain the same way real sentient beings did. Arthur answered every inquiry with flat, unflappable politeness, never raising his voice or showing a flicker of offense. His calm demeanor only annoyed Vesper further. She had wanted him to squirm, to weep, or to display some shred of pathetic defiance that she could crush beneath her psionic heel. Instead, his endless, unflappable patience felt less like submission and more like the eerie stillness of an unread book sitting on a shelf. As evening settled over the capital, casting long violet shadows across the manicured lawns, the atmospheric alarms finally began to shriek. They were not the melodic chimes the Valen used for routine announcements, but harsh, guttural claxons that echoed from the deep vaults beneath the palace. The ground lurched violently, spilling crystal goblets from silver trays and sending the assembled nobility into a panic of flashing lights and telekinetic shielding. Vesper instantly reached for her psionic focus, her eyes widening as she stared down toward the royal shrine built into the mountain base. Arthur caught her arm, not to steady himself, but to steady her, and quietly asked if the local priests had performed their scheduled morning maintenance, earning only a blank, terrified stare in return. The mountain groaned again, a deep, mechanical screech that vibrated straight through the crystal flooring of the grand ballroom. Guards scrambled in all directions, their psionic energy lances sparking uselessly as the ambient mana fields in the palace began to flicker and die. Vesper tried to project a telekinetic shield to calm the panicking ministers, but her mental focus shattered against the overwhelming seismic feedback shaking the stone beneath them. She turned to Arthur, expecting to find him cowering on the floor like the fragile primate her court believed him to be. Instead, he was methodically rolling up his sleeves, his face entirely devoid of fear, wearing instead the focused, clinical expression of a technician walking onto a hazardous industrial site. "What is happening?" Vesper demanded, her voice cutting through the chaos as she grabbed the collar of his tunic. "The wards are anchored by the collective will of the first house. No external force can shake this mountain." "Your wards aren't holding back an external force, Your Highness," Arthur replied calmly, slipping a compact diagnostic tool from his inner pocket, a device the palace security scanners had completely failed to identify as anything other than a medical tracker. "They're holding back an internal one. And based on that vibration frequency, whoever has been running your daily rituals has been skipping the alignment checks for at least a century." Before Vesper could process his words, the great archway leading to the subterranean royal shrine blew outward in a shower of ancient masonry and dead blue light. A suffocating wave of superheated air rushed up the spiral staircase, carrying the unmistakable scent of ozone and ancient oil. The high priests came stumbling backward out of the dark, weeping and clutching their robes, babbling about angry gods and divine retribution. Arthur sighed softly, looking down at his multi-tool with mild annoyance. Without waiting for royal permission, the feeble trophy husband stepped past the panicking guards, ducked under a falling lintel, and began walking straight down into the dark, humming abyss that the entire dominion feared to tread. Vesper followed him, driven less by common sense and more by sheer, outraged disbelief that her domestic property was ignoring a direct royal crisis. The spiral descent into the sub-basement grew progressively colder, the polished marble walls giving way to raw, grooved bedrock interlaid with dark metallic conduits that pulsed with erratic blue energy. The air grew thick, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that made Vesper's teeth ache and her psionic senses ring with static. Arthur moved with steady, measured strides, running a small handheld scanner over the conduit lines while ignoring the chaotic echoes of the palace above them. "Stop right there, human," Vesper commanded, her voice echoing off the metallic bulkheads as she drew her ceremonial blade. "You are walking into the holy sanctum of the progenitors. If the priests say the gods are angry, we fall back and pray, we do not." "They aren't gods, Vesper," Arthur interrupted without turning around, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom to illuminate massive blocks of inscribed metal that lined the tunnel walls. "Look at the glyphs. Those aren't prayers. Those are error logs. Your ancestors didn't find divine creators when they settled this world. They found a maintenance shaft for an automated planetary terraforming engine that had already suffered a catastrophic primary failure." Vesper froze, her golden eyes darting across the sprawling alien characters carved into the bulkhead. Though she had been taught since childhood to read these symbols as sacred scripture, her modern linguistic training suddenly clicked with Arthur's interpretation. The repeating patterns weren't hymns of praise, they were operational parameters, warning labels, and diagnostic checklists written in a language so old that even the imperial archives had forgotten its grammar. A cold knot of dread formed in her stomach as she realized the man she had married to insult Earth actually understood the core machinery of her entire civilization better than its highest-ranking priests. They reached the base of the descent, stepping out onto a massive circular platform suspended over an industrial abyss that plunged down into the planet's mantle. At the center of the chamber hung the source of the tremors, a colossal, multi-tiered lattice of dark metal and pale crystal cradling a dormant, towering silhouette that spanned hundreds of meters. The structure was violently stuttering, throwing off blinding arcs of raw energy that hissed through the damp air. Below the platform, head priestess Ilsa was curled on the floor, frantically reciting hymns that were being completely drowned out by the metallic shrieking of the failing containment field. "The cycle is broken," Ilsa sobbed, looking up at Vesper with wide, bloodshot eyes. "The divine heart rejects our devotion. The wrath of the ancients is upon us." It's not wrath, it's a blocked cooling valve, Arthur muttered, stepping past the weeping priestess and walking right up to the edge of the safety railing, mere meters away from the sparking lattice. Vesper grabbed his shoulder, her fingers digging into his tunic with genuine panic. Are you insane? That thing is radiating enough energy to vaporize this entire mountain. You don't have mana, you don't have a psionic field. If you touch that grid, your nervous system will fry before you can even blink. Arthur looked back at her, his expression entirely serene. Good thing I brought a grounding strap, then. He reached into his belt, pulling out a heavy, rubberized tether and clipping it securely to a titanium anchor point on the floor. He gave her a reassuring, almost gentle smile that completely dismantled every preconceived notion she held about his species. Stay behind the yellow line, Your Highness. If I'm not back up in 20 minutes, tell Earth they can keep the trade corridor. As Arthur stepped across the threshold and placed his bare hands directly onto the vibrating metal framework of the lattice, the entire chamber abruptly went dead silent. The frantic arcs of blue electricity vanished instantly, replaced by a steady, low-frequency hum that resonated not in the air, but directly inside their minds. Vesper stumbled back against the console, clutching her temples as a vast, ancient consciousness washed over her consciousness like a tidal wave of cold data. It was not the wrathful voice of a deity, but the heavy, exhausted processing stream of an automated machine that had been running diagnostics in the dark for 10,000 years. The entity spoke in concepts and compressed data packets, questioning the presence of the fragile, unenhanced primate touching its primary bus. Who approaches the core? Why do the maintenance rituals lack the correct verification sequences? Arthur did not flinch or drop his hands. Using a combination of spoken technical jargon and mental projection derived from his years of decommissioning deep space derelicts, he answered back with absolute clarity. He explained that his species had arrived late to the stars, that the current inhabitants of the surface had lost the operational manuals, and that the system's cooling loops were choking on centuries of uncorrected calcium and mana buildup. The vast consciousness in his mind paused, registering the precise logic of his words with a faint, systemic click of internal relays. The biological units on the surface offer worship instead of maintenance, the construct noted with digital weariness. The containment lattice is operating at 12% structural integrity. Total collapse is projected in 30 standard cycles. Are you here to purge the core or complete the shutdown? Neither, Arthur projected back calmly, his fingers tracing a sequence of manual override nodes along the panel. We're going to clean the filters, reset the primary valves, and get this machine back on a stable maintenance schedule. But I'm going to need you to damp down your output while I turn the wrench, because my wife is watching and I'd prefer not to be vaporized today. Outside the immediate field of the lattice, Vesper watched in paralyzed awe as the terrifying entity of her people's religion began to adjust its internal glow from an aggressive, blinding crimson to a steady, cooperative amber. Arthur was working with fluid, mechanical precision, pulling heavy service panels away from the bulkhead and manually cranking ancient gear assemblies that hadn't moved since before the Valen Dominion built its first starcruiser. Without magic, without psionic energy, and without a single drop of divine grace, her human husband was physically wrestling a cosmic engine back into alignment using sheer engineering discipline and a heavy-duty wrench. Head priestess Ilsa was still huddled on the floor, staring at Arthur with a mixture of horror and profound religious confusion. He is touching the sacred vessel, she whispered, her worldview completely fracturing before her eyes. He speaks to the Creator without a prayer. How does the machine listen to one who possesses no light? Because it's not a god, Ilsa, Vesper said quietly, her voice devoid of its usual imperial haughtiness as she stared at the man working at the center of the platform. It's a machine. And for the last 1,000 years, our entire civilization has been treating a broken boiler like an almighty ruler. The temperature in the chamber dropped sharply as Arthur cranked the final bypass valve, releasing a massive plume of harmless steam that hissed into the ventilation shafts above. The ground beneath their feet gave one final, shuddering sigh before locking completely into place. The deep, terrifying vibrations that had plagued the capital for days vanished entirely, replaced by the clean, quiet hum of a properly balanced reactor core. Arthur stood up, wiping a smear of black grease from his forehead, and untethered his grounding strap with a quiet sigh of relief. The return up the spiral staircase felt less like an evacuation and more like a procession of ghosts. When Arthur and Vesper stepped back out into the grand ballroom, they found King Doran and half the ministerial cabinet waiting in paralyzed silence, surrounded by shattered crystal and abandoned weapons. The psychic shockwaves had stopped, but the psychological shockwaves were only just beginning. Head Priestess Ilsa walked behind them with her head bowed, confirming in a trembling whisper to the sovereign that the mountain's heart had been quieted not by divine mercy, but by the manual intervention of the human groom. King Doran approached slowly, his golden eyes darting between his daughter and her quiet, grease-stained husband. He looked down at the heavy multi-tool still clutched in Arthur's hand, then up at the towering spires of the palace that suddenly felt very fragile against the backdrop of the stars. You entered the sanctum," the king said, his voice uncharacteristically hollow. "You faced the ancient anchor of our dominion. What demands do you bring from Earth for saving our capital?" "No demands, your majesty," Arthur replied evenly, casually tossing a small diagnostic drive onto the velvet table before the throne. "Just a recommendation that you update your maintenance schedules. If you want this trade corridor to remain stable, I suggest replacing your daily prayers with a bi-weekly pressure check on Sector 4. My species is quite fond of trade, but we prefer dealing with stable planets." Vesper stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with her husband rather than distancing herself from him as she had done just days prior. She looked at her father with a steady, unblinking gaze that brooked no argument. "The human is right, father. Our entire court has spent centuries worshipping our own ignorance. From now on, the Palace Engineering Corps will report directly to the diplomatic annex." Within a week, the news of what happened beneath the mountain spread across the Valen Dominion like wildfire, completely shattering the cultural supremacy of the noble castes. The revelation that their sacred gods were actually forgotten infrastructure maintained by a feeble, human engineer caused a massive philosophical crisis throughout the empire, but it also forced a profound, grudging respect for Earth. The trade treaty was renegotiated overnight, not as a lopsided concession dictated by imperial might, but as an equal partnership built on technological exchange and mutual survival. Princess Vesper's private quarters had undergone a radical transformation. The cold, sterile displays of psionic dominance were gone, replaced by sprawling structural blueprints, technical schematics, and field journals left behind by Human Engineering Corps. She spent her evenings sitting across the study table from Arthur, cross-examining him about deep space anomalies, automated terraforming grids, and how humanity had managed to survive exploring a galaxy full of ancient, dangerous derelicts without a single drop of natural magic. "I still cannot believe you walked right up to that core without a shield," Vesper murmured one evening, tracing the edge of Arthur's service wrench with her golden-flecked fingers. "My entire family thought you were a decorative pet we could use to mock your species. Instead, you turned out to be the only person in 3 star systems who knew how to keep our world from exploding." "Well, to be fair, Your Highness," Arthur smiled, leaning back in his chair with a cup of lukewarm earth tea. "You wanted a trophy husband who wouldn't give you any trouble. I figured keeping your planet from turning into a smoking crater was the least I could do to earn my keep." Months later, standing together on the high balcony to watch the twin suns of New Geneva sink beneath the horizon, the dynamic between the imperial princess and her human partner had completely inverted. The court no longer whispered behind their hands when Arthur walked the corridors, and the guards saluted him not out of fear, but out of a genuine, hard-earned recognition of competence. The iron shackle Vesper had placed on his wrist during the wedding day had long since been replaced by a simple, matching band of polished titanium, a symbol chosen not by royal decree, but by mutual choice. The Dominion had learned a humbling lesson about the nature of true power. Strength was not measured by how brightly a species could glow, how loudly their priests could pray, or how many worlds they could conquer with raw psionic force. Real power belonged to those who possessed patience, systemic discipline, and the quiet courage to walk into the dark and fix things when everyone else was too terrified to look under the hood. Humanity had entered the galactic stage not as subjects or subordinates, but as the indispensable mechanics of the cosmos. As Vesper leaned her head against Arthur's shoulder, watching the orbital freighters drift peacefully across the amber sky, she knew the title her court had whispered behind her back had finally come true in a way they never anticipated. She had wanted a trophy husband to mock the stars, but she had instead acquired a sovereign threat, a partner whose quiet, unassuming competence had quietly seized control of the entire empire's future, one wrench turn at a time. If you like the video, make sure to like and subscribe my channel.